And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Reverend Paul Johnson. He is our quarter-time minister, and we've been very blessed to have him this past year. He will be joining us for July 4th as the Soul of America. Let me know if you need anything whenever you're ready.
Very good. Thank you, Beth. Great to be with you on this hallowed weekend. In 1922, the noted British man of literature, G.K. Chesterton, made a trip to the U.S., and he was so impressed with the egalitarian nature of our society that when he got back home, he wrote a piece in which he dubbed us as the nation with the soul of a church. And a number of years later, Sidney Mead, the Unitarian historian, published a book of the same title. And he said, we're the only nation in history, according to his reckoning, that had a creed that was stated in dogmatic and theological fashion. And then, of course, he quotes those words of Jefferson, which I'm going to quote again to you. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, that was a copyist error. It should be inalienable rights. That among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To ensure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And whenever any government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the right of a people to alter or abolish it. So this is the underlying creed or soul of our country, according to Dr. Mead and G.K. Chesterton, and I agree with him. Jefferson then goes on to list 28 ways that the king had violated these principles through his tyranny. I'm not going to read all 28, though I have heard them enumerated, and it's quite a list. But among them are, number one, he has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and at a distance from their depository of their public records for his sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. Two, he has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasion of their rights. Three, he has made justices dependent upon his will alone to ensure their tenure and their payment for their salaries. Four, he has created a multitude of new officers and sent swarms of them to harass us and to eat out our substance. And five, he has cut off our trade and proposed taxes and imposed taxes upon us. Of course, this is the infamous taxation without representation, the Stamp Act, the Townsend Duties, the Sugar Act, and so forth. And I find it fascinating that all of these taxes were rescinded. And you know why? Because Americans boycotted British goods until they were taken off the books. The commerce between the U.S. and Britain went down by 2/3 after these taxes were imposed. So what did the 56 signers mean by being created equal, by equality? Well, of course, it's obvious they didn't mean that people were born with equal intelligence or talent or family wealth. What did they mean? Well, we know some things for sure. We know that Jefferson was very much influenced by the English philosopher John Locke. He had a principle that no person had a right to rule over another person. This was a jab at the doctrine of the divine right of kings. And Locke said, look at all the skullduggery and evil that created these royal lines in Europe. That certainly doesn't bespeak anything divine whatsoever. A logical extension, of course, is that no one has a right to hold another person in slavery. But we know that some of our founding fathers held slaves, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin among them. which seems rank hypocrisy, does it not, when you think of it? We know that Washington and Franklin freed slaves either while they lived or in their wills when they died. Jefferson freed 2 Hemmings family members while he was alive, and then 7 after his death. Of course, he very likely had children with the slave Sally Hemings. Approximately 200 were sold, of course, at the settling of his estate. And he was $100,000 in debt at the time of his death. So he had to be sold to settle those debts. I think it's interesting that John Adams, who died on the same day, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence, was $100,000 to the good in his estate when he died. But also in terms of equality, we know that Jefferson was much taken with John Locke's belief that all people are born with a blank slate, a tabula rasa, he called it. And everyone equally comes to understanding through experience by the use of the senses. This is different, of course, from the thinking of Plato and Aristotle that our immortal soul had a previous existence where it gained certain knowledge that could be derived to us through the process of dialectical discourse. But no, said Locke, everyone is born with a blank slate to be filled in through the senses of our experience or from hearing of the experiences of other people that's credible. So everyone is equal in this capability. And this is why Jefferson so fervently believed in public education. And on his tombstone, number 1, he didn't even mention that he was president of the United States on his tombstone, but that he was the founder of the University of Virginia and the author of the Declaration, of course, in that state of the disestablishment of the church and religious freedom, the separation of church and state. And he said to Madison that the university was to be their seminary for democracy, of human equality, and other moral discernment. Now, the equality before the law, of course, was very, very restricted when you think of it. Referred only to men of property, not to women, to slaves, to indentured servants or Native Americans. In some jurisdictions, Catholics could not vote or could even own property. So it was very restrictive, to say the least. Even though Jefferson said in his first inaugural address that job 1 was human equality and equal justice before the law. And I've often thought, what in the world were they thinking with this gross hypocrisy? Sometimes think, well, maybe it was like St. Paul in the Christian tradition who said, in Christ, there is neither bond nor free or male or female, all are one. But of course, he supported slavery. And so this somehow was a spiritual realm or something that had not anything to do with the everyday. But so over history, Unitarians, Universalists have cherished the traditions of Jefferson. But lately, there's been a good deal of dismay and anger about his legacy. And the Mid-South District had been named Thomas Jefferson District, but they took that name off because of being unhappy with his legacy. But I think, despite this, we can thank Jefferson for planting the seed of human equality that has grown over the years. It's been a movement towards greater and greater realization. Theodore Parker, the Unitarian minister who was a staunch abolitionist, harked back to the Declaration of Independence in his work. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Unitarians, harked back to the Declaration of Independence in their work for women's legal rights, especially for the right to vote. I think one of the greatest tragedies in our American history is that those women who worked so hard never lived to see the women's vote, but they were responsible for it nonetheless. Martin Luther King challenged the nation to live out the Declaration in our national life, leading, I believe, to the civil rights legislation of the 60s, public accommodations, voting rights, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, equal rights have been granted in many situations and places to people of all sexual orientations. Um, Amazingly, our Supreme Court a number of years ago established marriage equality. Which I had not expected. I don't know if any of you expected that. I never expected that would happen in the timely fashion that it did. Now, there's many different things that I could mention that we need to continually work on to embody more and more in our national life this principle of human equality. One thing I think that's a positive, of course, is that the Supreme Court has said that in criminal cases, everyone has the right to legal representation, right? But that doesn't relate to civil cases where we have a whole apparatus for people to have their grievances dealt with and adjudicated. But there's really is not a way for so many people to do this because they can't afford to have a lawyer. But I was involved in my first congregation in Minnesota. I was on a first call for help group of people that help people with many different things. But one of the things we did was to help people get legal representation in civil cases where they didn't have the means, and all sorts of disputes that people get involved with. And the local bar association had agreed to take these cases on, and we had a list of all the lawyers available, and we would refer people to these lawyers. Now, the man who headed up our agency there had been at it many years, and he knew intimately all of those lawyers. And I would say, John, I referred people to such and such a lawyer today. He would say, oh, that's great. He really follows through and he does a good job. And then I would say another lawyer, a different day, and he'd say, oh boy, he just doesn't do a good job. So it was not good, consistent representation for everyone. Now that changed when Carter brought in the Legal Services Administration, and we referred people to them and they got very good service. I found myself, to a lot of these folks, heralding the virtue of small claims court where they didn't have to have a lawyer. And if it was beneath a certain amount of money, they could go without all of the forms of evidence and in a regular court of law. And I was able to steer several people to that. And I think that's a wonderful institution, the small claims court. I assume they have it in Florida, but they've had it in the other states in which I live. But, and of course, economic equality is a tough one in our country and involves so many things I can't get into, of course, in this sermon this morning. But if the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is due all of us, is this really possible without equal access to medical care? And through much of our history, the point has been made that if you can't afford it, you don't deserve it, right? And happily, there's been Medicare and Medicaid, but unfortunately, so many states have refused to expand Medicaid coverage, so millions of people are still uncovered. That's another area of human equality that calls for our commitment to make the American dream more of a reality. And I'll just mention, of course, the disparities of income that grow and grow, and people at the lower rungs sometimes have to work 2 or 3 jobs to provide life's necessities. When I was 8 years old, my dad took me out for the first time, as he is a minister, and he would bring out food to indigent poor people at Christmas time. And I had never been in a desperately poor home before. And I remember Christmas Eve, when I was 8 years old, my dad brought me with him, and he'd bring these bushel baskets full of food that were greatly appreciated by these families. But to see the way they lived, and I remember the last house we went to on Christmas Eve, before going back to our own family celebrations, was bare, just the pot-bellied stove and 4 beds in different corners of a room, no Christmas tree, no gifts. And we went home to a Christmas tree full of gifts, and my grandma and my mom had been working for weeks to make all the Norwegian delicacies for Christmas. And I thought, this is not fair. This is not equal. And of course, it's not. And that continues to gnaw at me in terms of the American equality. Now, we can't hope for a day where everyone's going to have equal resources, and that maybe wouldn't even be fair. But to be able to have the basic necessities and not to have that as a constant, constant thing gnawing at one. And of course, I saw it again when I was a census enumerator in 2020 in Martin County. I went into some of these gated communities. I remember one house I had to knock on the door or ring the doorbell to enumerate them, and a contractor was operating nearby. They weren't home, but he told me that this was a very wealthy family, and he had built that home a few years before for $24 million. But then I'd go to the trailer courts where immigrants did have vast family numbers crowded into one very substandard type of unit. And then I was one of those chosen on that one night of the census enumeration where you go out and you enumerate the homeless, and went into these enclaves out in the woods, into these places where families were living in cars in order to enumerate them. And isn't that a tragedy in terms of the wealthiest country in the world? Equality, at least merging towards some sort of equality within our country. You know, as we look back on those men, 56 men who signed that document, we have to realize that they were signing their death warrant if the colonists had not prevailed. Remember how it ends? They pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And that really was the case, because so many of them suffered grievously. 5 of them were captured by the British, and a number of historians say that they were tortured. 12 had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 of them lost their sons in the war. Another had 2 captured. 9 of the 56 died from wounds or hardships from the war. Carton Braxton, a wealthy planter and trader, had his ships sunk by the Navy. He had to sell his personal property to pay his debts at the end of the war, and he died in poverty. And there was a fellow by the name of Thomas Nelson, and at the final battle at Yorktown, General Cornwallis of the British forces demanded that his house be turned over to be used as his headquarters. And Nelson went to Washington. He said, before this can happen, I want you to fire and destroy my house, which he did to keep it out of British hands. He died in bankruptcy. John Hurt was driven from his wife's bedside as she lay dying at the advance of British troops. And he fled with his 15 kids and lived out in the woods and for a long time, until it was safe to go back to his house. His wife had died, and of course all his kids were dead. And he died a few weeks later from exhaustion. So much was sacrificed in order to bring the Declaration of Independence in fruition in terms of founding of a new nation. I often ask myself, well, what am I willing to put myself out for and sacrifice for? And I heard some wonderful things in the personal sharing this morning that people are doing to advance the human dream of the American dream of human equality. One thing that has been on my conscience and thoughts for a long time is, and President Biden, in one of his proposals, was dealing with it, and that is to provide tuition-free education for students in our community colleges. Excuse me. I read an article not too long ago that keeps track of the financial needs of community college students. And so few of them are able to finish their 2-year or 4-year course because of financial difficulties, because you're dealing with people often at the lower rung of economic security, because of childcare issues or employment issues or whatever, they have to drop out. And I remember in my former congregation down in Stewart, I said, this is one way we could make a significant difference towards equality of opportunity, to provide a scholarship for someone at a community college. And we did it. And I don't know if I hope they're still doing it year after year, but that's one way I think that a congregation can make a commitment towards equality within our society. And I want to close with a remarkable, wonderful statement by President Lincoln. He spoke at Independence Hall, February 22nd, 1861, in which he said that everything that he had done in politics was motivated by the Declaration of Independence. He said, I've often inquired of myself what has kept this confederation together so long. He said, it was not solely a matter of separation of the colonies from the motherland, but that sentiment in the Declaration of Independence, which gave liberty not alone to the people of this country, but ultimately, I hope, to the people of the whole world for all future time. It was that which gave that promise gave weight that all can be lifted from I'm trying to read my writing here, that weight could be lifted from the shoulders of all people. This is the sentiment embodied in the Declaration of Independence. And I think it's a wonderful statement for us as we celebrate this holiday. And every 4th of July, I think back to my most memorable 4th of July. And that was July 4th, 1975. I had just graduated from Meadville Lombard Theological School at the University of Chicago. And I had the honor of being invited to be an interim person at the Washington Office for Social Concern of our denomination. They were between directors. And so it was only be for 3 months, but then I was go to my first congregation. But they extended it to 6 months. But on July 4th, I had arrived in Washington 3 days before, and I went to the 4th of July celebration down on the ellipse, between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Monument, and then off to one side is the Jefferson Memorial. And I had finished at Meadville and had gotten to know one of the most famous historians of religion in the world, Mircea Eliade. He said, one of the prime features of religion is to bring the sacred past into the present, to bring the sacred into the profane, to bless the profane and give it meaning. And his thoughts were in mine when I went to that celebration. There were patriotic speeches, there were patriotic bands, and I looked over at Jefferson's monument and Washington's monument and Lincoln's monument, and I was caught up in sacred time. And I joined a snake dance of hundreds of people, ecstatic at the thought of the United States Declaration of Independence and its claim for human equality. So I hope you have a celebration. Maybe you have one particular 4th of July that you can hark back to that will be your personal sacred time to bring it into the present. But so may it be for all of us. Amen.